This one is A&P, Module 8, Lectures number 2, Part B, whatever that might be. So we made it to page 3, and what we've been doing is looking at the functional areas of the cerebrum, and have enjoyed some interesting discussion from that stuff. So, how do you become familiar with this? You just go over and over the notes. These are the stuff that I'm going to test you over. So I haven't asked you to memorize it. I've asked you to become familiar with it and to become familiar with the pictures. All right. And as a matter of fact, some of these pictures aren't bad to draw either, I might add. Again, that's probably hard for some of you. You're not talented in that way, and so you don't have to do any of it, and you don't have to do it to do well on the test, but it surely is helpful in terms of learning the material. That's all I'll have to say about that. So we are looking at the visual association area. That's where we made it to the middle of page 3, and look on page 225. You see it there listed, kind of a light brown visual association area. So it is, we discussed this last time, but we're going to start there anyway. It receives action potentials from the visual cortex, compares the image to past experience in order to give context. So that's the part that recognizes faces and objects. So my visual association area is highly developed. I will recognize your face. Just don't ask me to get your name. I'm talking about years to come. So that part of my brain is functional, but there's others that are not. So the primary auditory area on the temporal lobe. So what's the word I want? The words are on the bottom of that figure 8.4, and you see it pointing there to the central area of the cerebrum. It's responsible for the basics of sound. So it hears volume and pitch. If it's too high, it's too low. So I always tell my kids, if I got the music cranked up, that if it's too loud, you're too old. So anyway. The auditory association area puts sounds into context. It recognizes a song, a bell, a speech. In other words, the association area helps you determine, what that sound is. Some of these radio stations have those contests, right, where they do a sound, and you're supposed to come up with what that sound was. And, I never can come up. So this area must not be well developed in me, but I can never come up with that stuff. But anyway, that's what helps you determine which is which. Look at the Wernicke's area. The Wernicke's area. It's the sort of the purple circle or whatever that might be towards the posterior there. If the sound is speech, the signal is sent here to comprehend the speech. So that's what helps us understand speech in terms of its taste. The taste area, you see at the left side where it's depicted, it just interprets taste. Okay? The olfactory area interprets the signals from the nose, gives the sense of smell. It's on the interior surface of the frontal lobe. So in terms of that. The primary motor area, or the primary motor cortex. So that's the very top one to the left. You see it there depicted in that kind of golden brown, right in the middle of the cerebrum. It is localized mostly just to one gyrus on each side of the cerebrum. It's anterior to the central sulcus. It's called the precentral gyrus. It has little sections, actually, which control specific areas of muscles. So little sections that control things such as the hip, the tongue, etc. It controls basic skeletal movements. In other words, making a fist, or extending the leg or the hands, that is the result of signals sent from that primary motor cortex right there in the middle of the cerebrum. The premotor area is skilled fine motor movement. You see that premotor area there and how large it is, even compared to the primary motor cortex. It is the preparatory work of deciding what action potential must be sent and how quickly and in what order they are sent to the primary motor area, which carries out the instructions. So in terms of, and it would make sense, right? You would have a larger section of brain to determine the amount of response, of physical response to those various areas of the primary motor cortex. You want to know whether or not, you know, the reaching is gentle to move the book, or it's fast or hard, and that is determined in the premotor area. So the Broca's area, again, that's kind of, if I can, my color is right here, it's kind of that purplish disc there. The Broca's area is written at the bottom of figure 8.4. It's a subsection of the premotor area. It works out the detailed sequencing for the finest of muscle movements, and the finest of muscle movements are those related to speech. The Wernicke's area determines what words to speak, sending signal potentials to the Broca's area that then works out the details and the sequence of the muscle movement needed to produce the words. You just think about all of the detail that's necessary for me to do what I'm doing now, and that is boring you to tears. All right, but think of all of the muscle detail necessary to change from this tone to this tone to this tone, to speak in an accent, to do this, the variety of different things. It's a phenomenal thing that God has developed. Speech in and of itself is testimony of the true and living God. The spoken word, of course, it represents Him anyway, but in any respect. The prefrontal area is where you would anticipate it being. It's in the front. So it's that dark green. Dedicated to reason and thinking things through, prediction, motivation, and aspects of personality. There is in the prefrontal area. Commissures are connections of nerve fibers which allow the two hemispheres of the brain to communicate with each other. The largest commissure is the corpus callosum. The most functional areas of the cerebrum are in both hemispheres. Exceptions of Broca's area being speech, mathematical reasoning on the left, spatial relationships, music, face recognition to the right. Just a brief comment about right and left brain thinking. I've mentioned it before, I believe I have. There are anatomists, physiologists who now disagree with this. I still think it's accurate. I haven't seen anything that would make me change my mind. But in terms, and again, these things that we just mentioned, mathematical reason, spatial relationships, music, both sides of the brain are involved in these things, both sides. But in terms of specialization, yes, there's some types of thinking that are more specialized to the left hemisphere in right-handed people, in the right hemisphere in the left-handed people, and other types of thinking that are more specialized in the right brain. And so, in terms of that, you have folks who tend to have talents where they're able to perhaps access various sides of the brain more efficiently than others. In other words, there's some folks who can just do math like this, all right? And then there's others who struggle in math. There's some who are able to do large thinking, spatial type thinking. They're artistically oriented. They're able to look at something and depict it in ways that others of us just laugh at the prospect of that. Again, it has to do with development sometimes on these various hemispheres. There's another aspect to this, and this is the part that's debated, especially in the highly charged day of this, guys, the idea of transsexual people who decide that they're going to become a different sexual orientation. I mean, this is tragedy. In your lifetime, I hope that people come back to sanity with respect to this. This is not people who have been physiologically developed in a male body to become, and then are actually females. It's insanity. It just is, and it has been for millennia before the recent time when that's suddenly an issue. And I'm clueless with regards to how that can possibly be. And now it's caught hold in culture, so you have people more inclined to think this way. But I've talked with folks who believe, let me just finish this and I'd be glad to take your question, but I've counseled folks who struggled with this. One man he was halfway through the sex conversion therapy. In other words, he was living as a woman and was set to have anatomical surgery performed when he began to rethink. And so that's when he showed up in my office, and we talked for a long time, and he determined that that probably was not a good idea. He was married, he had kids. There is a number of issues in his life that predated his decision to think this way, and we talked about them, and you could see how they set him up to begin to think this way. It wasn't physiological. It was behavioral. It was the context of his family growing up. And so that's been the thinking forever, and that's compassionate with regards to people in their approach to life. And now the idea of compassion is to do surgery on someone and transform them into someone that they weren't born to be. I mean, I hope in your lifetime that this thinking straightens up for the sake of those poor people. I mean, and again, I would, and maybe some of you want to challenge me, but I would be condemned for this in some places, and that's just a statement of compassion. But the point of all of this is, and I'm not sure how I got off on it. Oh, brain functioning. I'm going to get to you in just a second. So, in utero, the anatomical, the physiological differences between men and women are real. They are from day one. The sperm and egg come together and form a male and female, and the process of developing male and female continue after that. In utero, the little baby boy's brain is bathed at some point in a testosterone bath, so to speak. Testosterone washes over what we just said, the corpus callosum, in the process destroying some of those connections. All right? So coming out, you have boys who actually have less connectivity to both sides of the hemisphere than girls. Girls are more able to access both sides of their brain than boys. And so it is a correct statement. Boys are brain damaged. All right? We're all brain damaged. But it also sort of suggests why men very often, and it's evident in most relationships, if you haven't gone there yet, you will, think differently than women a lot of times. Many men are more directed towards left brain thinking, logical, linear type thinking, whereas women are, again, these are generalities, there's no absolutes in my statement. Women are more adept at looking at the whole, at seeing. Left brain thinking looks and sees the eyes. Right brain thinking looks and sees the whole face. Okay, so women are more adept at a variety of different things that are given to using both sides of the brain. So the point of all of this is that human beings are wonderfully made and unique to sex as well. So I'll shut up with that. Yes, sir. What was your question?
What are your thoughts on people who are born with both parts, both sexual parts?
They're so unique. The hematophore.
Do you think they have the right to make the choice?
Oh, of course. And one is almost always dominant. Yeah. So it's not like you have very, very seldom do you ever have a functioning pair of gonads, male and female gonads. Very, very rarely is that ever the case. Most of the time, one is more of like an appendage. But of course, I mean, someone that is genuinely born with two sets, they can choose to be what they want, choose to be what direction they think they are. But I come to think of it, there must be some, but I don't even know of any that have functioning sets, both sets. I have to look that up. I'm not sure. But good question. Good question. Thank you. All right. Anybody want to challenge me on that? I mean, because I have no desire to put you at unease. I'd rather put you at ease. But if you are uneasy about my statement and would like to ask me about it, I'd be glad to talk about it. Anybody? Okie dokie. Other important brain structures. So if you would, we are to page 229. The basal nuclei. Lumps of gray matter below the cortex of the cerebrum, and they're involved in planning, in initiation, in maintenance, and termination of motor activity. So they maintain muscle tone and adjustments to maintain posture. If damage is done to the basal nuclei, there may be tremors or dysfunctions of the muscles and coordination. They're made up of the lentiform nucleus. And so again, in terms of what I'm talking about here, I'm on page 229, and there's a nice handy little figure 8.5 to help us to take a look at this stuff. So there's the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus together, which are called the corpus striatum. So that is depicted there in terms of the little brown wormy looking thing. And they're the largest of the basal nuclei. The subthalamic nucleus is in the diencephalon, and then the substantia nigra is in, the midbrain. The amygdaloid nucleus is part of the everybody limbo, the limbic system, a series of nuclei and commissures that run through the cerebrum and the diencephalon and influence mood, emotion, fear, the senses of pain and pleasure, and the amygdaloid nucleus plays a role in survival instincts, the desire for food and water and reproduction. So again, you see the location there as depicted in the figure of the amygdaloid nucleus. The hippocampus is, let me see if it's depicted over here, and it is not. So it is a seahorse-shaped structure that takes care of a significant portion of memory. So that is the portion of me that is severely damaged. So it remembers a person's name. When you see a person, the hippocampus remembers their name, while the amygdaloid nucleus attaches emotions to that person, such as love, friendship, anger. So if you see me on the street in a year or two from now, if you will perhaps recognize me, and then you might remember my name, and then you'll have immediate feelings of anger, dislike. That's coming from the hippocampus. So, and you can remember that. So when you see me and you go, you can say to yourself, that's my hippocampus. It's remembering him. That's just a terrible problem. All right, turn over to page 231. Look at the ventricles of the brain, figure 8.6. Brain cavities. In fetus central nervous systems begin as a hollow tube, and they grow and change shape, eventually forming cavities in each of the hemispheres of the brain, as well as in the diencephalon and midbrain. Those cavities produce the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, a fluid that cushions and provides, well, a few nutrients to the brain. The ventricles are lined with epidermal cells, neuroglia that produce and secrete the cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricles. The epidermal cells and their support cells and blood vessels, which supply them with oxygen and nutrients, are collectively called the choroid plexus. That means lacy, all right? The ventricles consist of, and again, as we talk, you can look at the picture there, they consist of lateral ventricles, and you see those depicted. Are there in each hemisphere of the brain, left and right lateral ventricles. 80% of your cerebrospinal fluid is produced in these two ventricles. And then the third ventricle is in the diencephalon. You see that depicted there as well. The fourth ventricle is in the midbrain. All of these ventricles or cavities connect with each other. The two lateral ventricles connect with the third by the interventricular foramina. So you see that depicted, well, you know, it's not that great, but you see how, if those are little lakes, you see how one lake is flowing into the next. All right. The two foramina, that's the plural, of course, of foramen. The third is connected with the fourth by the cerebral aqueduct. These connections allow cerebrospinal fluid to flow freely from the, say that fast, to flow freely from the lateral ventricles. I'm having a good time. I know you're bored. From the lateral ventricles to the fourth and on to the surface of the brain or into the spinal cord. So if you have ever had a epidural or a spinal, you know that's where the medication was delivered by shot. So we've hustled through a lot of stuff. Let's see if you've got any questions for me. Now, slowly, quiet. No, one at a time. All right, turn over to 232. Look at the pretty picture on 232. There's all kinds of stuff you could draw here, but you don't necessarily need to draw this one, although it's pretty. So, as the most complex, sensitive organ of the body, the brain needs to be well protected, obviously, right? Protection begins with the skull. All right, in terms of this, we have the meninges. Look at figure 8.7 on page 232. So you have the meninges of the brain depicted there. Those are three specific layers of tissue, layers, as Shrek says, of tissue that surround and protect the brain. All right, let's look at them. You have the meninges. They're three, in terms of the dura mater, there's the layer right below the skull, and that is depicted there. You see it in sort of a darkish pink. So it is attached firmly to the peristeum of the skull and extends down into the major fissures of the brain to tube-like openings called the dural sinuses. They collect blood and cerebrospinal fluid that returns from the brain, emptying into blood vessels which leave the skull and go back to the heart. So that's the lowest of the low, so to speak, in terms of we see it there, the dura mater, and you see the dural sinus that we're discussing in terms of the delivery of that CSF back into the circulatory system. So the arachnoid matter, arachnida, of course, is that species or file? Which one is which? Help the boy on his zoology. I can't remember. But anyway, so of spiders. It's the web-like tissue below the duramater. The space between the duramater and the arachnoid mater is called the subdural space, filled with a small amount of cerebrospinal fluid that moistens the tissue. So you see the arachnoid mater there just below the duramater. Then you have the pia mater, and that is, pia means affectionate. It binds tightly to the brain itself. The space between the arachnoid mater and the pianat mater is called the subarachnoid space, and it contains strands of arachnoid tissue. We're over to page 5. The meninges can be, excuse me, did I finish that? Seems like a strange way to finish that. Let's see. Yeah, oh, okay. Contains strands of arachnoid mater and a lot of CSF. So the meninges can be infected by a virus or a bacteria and cause potentially a fatal inflammation. And you know that well, or maybe you don't know that well, but you might know it since you perhaps have had vaccinations for it already. But meningitis, what happens with meningitis is the virus or the bacteria cause an immune response, and that immune response actually is what produces pus. Again, part of the immune response, as you will remember from our earlier conversations, is inflammation, and that can accumulate in the subarachnoid space, and it can block the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, leading to possible paralysis or coma or even death. And so it's a very dangerous disease. The CSF flowing through the subarachnoid space eventually reaches the arachnoid granulations, which dump the CSF into a dural sinus, where it mixes with blood, it's picked up by the veins and carried out of the brain. And this movement is caused by villi. Those are ciliated and non-ciliated ependymal cells, and the pressure of additional CSF being made by the ependymal cells. So in terms of, I mean, you've done it since you were a kid, right? You know, you do this thing, and you go until you're doing this deal, right? Woohoo! So what is all of that? Well, it has to do with your eyes and some other things, but it also can have to do with the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid that gets it going when what's the effect? Help the boy, I'm failing today. What's the effect when you're moving and you stop? Say what? Yeah, centrifugal, yeah. Oh, I tell you. But anyway, so the cerebrospinal fluid gets to moving, and then you stop, but your brain's thinking you're still going. So in any respect. All right. So we finished our conversations about the brain. Is there any questions? Any more thinking about the brain? Yes.
It's not really a question, but you can actually trick your brain into thinking that you're doing some sort of something.
Would you speak just a little bit louder?
You can trick your brain into thinking that you're doing like a somersault or like tilting backwards. I did it at the Space and Rocket Center at a convention I went to, where you sit in a chair and you like lay your head like to the side, or you put it like on your knee with your fist to your ear, and they spin you around. And when you sit up, it's like you're tilting backwards, or you're tilting forward, or like spinning to the side.
That's fascinating.
It's really weird. It simulates what like jet fighter and fighter pilots feel.
For heaven's sakes.
And so they do it to basically prepare themselves for that feeling and to fly while experiencing that in their brain.
That's an excellent comment. And how would you be knowing that?
I did the chair.
I was curious. Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. Thank you. I really appreciate that, Madeline. That's an excellent comment. Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else? We have reached the spinal cord, page 5 of your notes and page 235 in your textbook. And please look at figure 8.9. It's such a pretty little picture right there. Right there is our spinal cord. So, some bulleted points. Once again, diamond bulleted points. That's the communications link between the peripheral nervous system and the brain. So that's how everything that you are sending it based on your sense perception, that sort of thing, gets there. It's through the spinal cord. Without it, the brain would not receive much sensory information and could not control much of the body, which of course we know is what happens to those who experience the tragedy of spinal cord injury. It is continuous with the brain. It's the brain's ponytail. I like that. Oh. There was actually a time when I had hair and I could do that. Oh. But anyway, you see the ponytail there to the brain, the little mid drawing. It's encased in the vertebral column, but not quite as long as the vertebral column, reaching to the second lumbar vertebra. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that exit the spinal cord and travel through the vertebral column, through the intravertebral foramina. It generally decreases in diameter as it moves away from the brain. But there's two exceptions to that. There is the cervical enlargement. The diameter increases so that the nerves of the upper limbs can enter and exit the cord. And then the lumbar enlargement, the diameter increases so that the nerves of the lower limbs can enter and exit the spinal cord. So that makes sense. You're going to have a widening of the spinal cord here near the shoulders and then down near your legs. Just below the lumbar enlargement, the spinal cord tapers to a cone-like structure, the conus medullaris, or the cauda equina. The structure and many nerves that attach to it kind of look like a horse's tail, and that's what you see depicted there at the bottom of that illustration in the middle. So, viewing a cross-section of the spinal cord, there is white matter, and that's organized into 3 columns. The dorsal column, the ventral column, and the lateral column. You see those depicted there to the right in terms of the figure 8.9. The dorsal column is the back side of the spinal cord. The ventral is the belly side of the spinal cord, and the lateral column is the side of the spinal cord. These columns are further divided into fascicules. Those are nerve tracts, and they're axons which carry action potentials to or from the brain, and they're grouped together so that they can carry the same type of information. Each one is a fasciculus. So again, in terms of our depictions there, you can kind of get an idea from that. I don't think there was not a better description. Okay, the dorsal roots in terms of this thing, you see that depicted on the left side of figure 8.9. The dorsal root enter the spinal cord at the posterior horn and carry afferent signals from the sensory receptors to the spinal cord. The ventral roots, so again, that's depicted near the bottom of the left drawing, leaves the spinal cord at the ventral horn and carries efferent action potentials from the spinal cord to the effectors. The dorsal and ventral roots come together to form a spinal nerve. So that's what we're talking about here. That's how they are depicted. The spinal cord needs to be protected like the brain, and it's continuous with the brain. So, like the brain, it has the similar 3 meningeal layers. The pia mater covers the spinal cord. The space between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater is the arachnoid space, and that, if you would turn over, is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The arachnoid mater is the web-like space between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, and the space between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater is the subdural space. The dura mater is the outer layer, but is not attached in this instance to the vertebral column like it is in the skull. The space between the dura mater and the spinal column is called the epidural space. It contains spinal nerves, blood vessels, and connective tissue and fat. And epidural, again, I hope none of you have had to have an epidural. Anybody here had that? Okay, anybody been in the delivery room with mom as she was going to deliver a baby, and she had an epidural? So I don't know if anybody's seen that or not. But anyway, it is injected into this epidural space, and it deactivates the spinal nerves so that afferent pain signals don't reach the brain. My sister just had knee replacement surgery, and instead, she's 70, 71, 73. How can that be? But she is. Anesthesia becomes increasingly dangerous as you get older, general anesthesia. And so she needed this knee replacement, and they did a epidural on her to perform that, which I thought that was pretty exciting because of the danger, again, of general anesthetic. I want to talk about the reflex arc. It's introduced on page 237. If you will notice, there are many pages of reflex arc. All right? What I want you to know about the reflex arc, I have given you in your notes. That's all I want you to know. All right? And we're going to make it today. The reflex arc. So, on page 238, it officially is titled a reflex arc. Sometimes the spinal cord, not the brain, controls movements of the muscles. Isn't that interesting? So you'd think it's the thinking process that controls the movements of muscles, at least in terms of those that we choose. The reflex arc, when touching something hot, pain receptors, or part of the peripheral nervous system, are stimulated, and they send an afferent message to the spinal cord. That's part of the central nervous system, which integrates that information and makes a judgment as to what to do. In this instance, it sends an outgoing message to the flexor muscles, telling them to get your hand off of that stove burner. All right? So that's what it does. It sends outgoing message to the flexor muscles, telling them to contract. All of this happening without brain involvement. Isn't that cool? And so when we're little and we're doing stuff that we're not supposed to do, like such as my youngest daughter was, she shared a bed, and sometimes she couldn't sleep at night, and when she was 4 or 5, I guess, she decided she was going to play with the electrical outlet. And so she was playing with the electrical outlet, and guess what happened? It scared the daylights out of her. Didn't want to sleep in that bed anymore. But the point is, once it started to hurt, that hand immediately comes out of the tip of that electrical outlet. And then, in terms of that, this happens without brain involvement. What's going on here in terms of the reflex arc is it's needed very, very, extra fast action It's hard, if not impossible, to choose to place your hand back in that electrical outlet ever again, or to choose to put your hand down on a burner. I mean, you know, I guess some people would do that, but it's really hard because of what you have learned first by reflex arc. It's bypassed the brain, but see, then the brain becomes involved in reflex arc in order to form an experience, and that's how we learn. That's how little ones, and again, they're told to stay away from the stove, but they still mess around, put their hand on it. They don't do that anymore because the brain has said to you, don't do that. That's stupid. All right, you're going to hurt yourself. We're not going to do something damaging again. So what this thing is called is a diverging circuit. It takes the afferent message and diverges it into two different neurons. The association neuron that stimulates the reflex arc, and a neuron that sends that message to the brain. The reflex acts quickly, the brain learns from the experience. So the same information goes two different directions, one of which helps you, and the other one which helps you more long term. When the brain learns, it sends a signal to the converging circuit. It allows both the reflex and the brain neurons to send signals to the effector neurons. Therefore, both the brain and the reflex arc control the effector, again, by reflex or conscious thought. In terms of ascending and descending pathways in the spinal cord, if you, let's see here, a sensory pathway. So look at page 241 and 243. You get a sense for what we're talking about here. But again, I didn't go into, I have no desire for you to have a lot. Oh no, I'm sorry. Page 239 is, well, no, I take that back. That's still not it. Anyway, let's read what I got. And this is, as I say, with regards to reflex arc, this is what I want you to know. If you get questions in terms of your textbook on the reflex arc and it doesn't reflect this information, you can skip them. All right? The spinal cord serves as a conduit for messages from the brain to the peripheral nervous system and the peripheral nervous system back to the brain. The information travels on two specific pathways. This is what I wanted you to know. The motor pathway is the descending pathway that carries signals from the central nervous system, in other words, the brain and the spinal cord, down to the muscles. The sensory pathway is the ascending one that carries action potentials from the receptors, the little tips of your fingers and your eyes and these sorts of things, of the peripheral nervous system up the spinal cord to the brain. All right? We're done.